Morning my husband left for his work conference in Denver, he kissed me on the cheek, adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, and told me not to forget to water his mother's orchids on the windowsill. Like always. Like everything was perfectly fine. I watched his silver Audi back out of the driveway, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I felt nothing. No sadness, no longing. Just this low, hollow quiet that had been living in my chest for months. Then I heard it. The soft creak of floorboards from down the hall, the slow shuffle of feet that were supposed to be incapable of shuffling. My stepson Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway, standing, fully upright, looking at me with those serious dark eyes of his, the same eyes his father had, except his held something his father's never did. Honesty. I didn't scream, I didn't even move. I just stared at this 13-year-old boy who would spend the last 2.5 years in a wheelchair in front of me, and I heard myself say, very quietly, "How long?" He swallowed. "Since before you married him." I need to back up. My name is not important. What's important is that I was 29 years old when I married a man I genuinely believed was my second chance. I'd grown up in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, and I'd spent most of my 20s working as a dental hygienist and convincing myself that the reason my relationships never worked out was bad timing, not bad judgment. My husband. I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, even though saying the word now makes my jaw tighten, was 41. He had a son from his first marriage. His first wife had died in a car accident 3 years before we met. That's what he told me. A car accident on I-70 in January. Black ice. She never saw the semi coming. He told me this on our third date at a wine bar in downtown Columbus, and I remember he got quiet after he said it, stared at his glass, and I reached across the table and put my hand over his. I felt so much tenderness for him in that moment. I thought, here is a man who has suffered. Here is a man who is real. Ely, he explained, had been in the accident too. He'd survived, but suffered severe spinal trauma. The doctors said he would never walk again. My husband cried telling me this, actual tears running down his face, and I thought I was watching a man break open in front of me. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. I should have asked why a man with a paralyzed son and a substantial income never hired a home nurse, never enrolled Eli in adaptive physical therapy, never took him to the specialists at Nationwide Children's Hospital that every parent I knew in Columbus would have moved mountains to access. Instead, I fell in love, or what I thought was love. And 8 months later, we got married at a small ceremony in his backyard, and I moved into his house in Bexley, and I became the primary caregiver for a boy who had every reason to be broken and somehow, impossibly, wasn't. Ely was quiet. He watched everything. He read constantly. Thick paperbacks, military history, true crime, anything with a puzzle at the center. He didn't talk much in front of his father, but when it was just the two of us, he would sometimes say things that stopped me cold. Little observations. You know he turns his phone face down whenever you walk in the room. Or he told his friend on the phone that the life insurance payout would set things straight. I heard him through the vent. I brushed it off. I told myself Eli had been through trauma, that he was processing his grief sideways, that 13-year-old boys from broken homes sometimes developed paranoid attachments to new parental figures. I told myself this because the alternative, that the man I had legally bound myself to was dangerous, was something I wasn't ready to hold. Then one morning in March, I woke up to the smell of gas. It was a Thursday. My husband had left for Denver the night before, which meant I was alone in the house with Eli, who was asleep in his room on the first floor. I'd been awake for maybe 30 seconds before I understood that the smell wasn't a dream, wasn't my imagination. It was thick and low in the air, the kind of smell that gets into your sinuses and sits there, faintly sweet, unmistakably wrong. I got out of bed and into the hallway, and the smell was stronger. Coming from downstairs. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. It was dead, completely drained. The charger had been mysteriously not fully plugged in, which I would think about later. And I moved toward the stairs. That's when I heard Eli's door open. And then his footsteps, quick, certain, moving toward the kitchen. I came down the stairs to find him crouched in front of the stove, twisting the gas valve closed with both hands. He was wearing his grey socks and a Columbus crew hood, and he looked up at me and said, perfectly calm, "Don't turn on any lights, don't touch any switches. Go open the back door and the window above the sink." I did exactly what he said. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the door handle, but I got it open. Cold March air poured in. Ely crossed the window and pushed it up from the inside, and we both stood there in the dark kitchen, not speaking, just breathing carefully, listening to the house exhale around us. After a few minutes, he said, "I found it last night before I went to bed. The back burner valve was turned on just enough. Not all the way. All the way would have been obvious. Just enough that by morning the house would be full of it." I looked at him. "Ely, I've been waiting for something like this," he said. "I didn't know what shape it would take, but I knew it was coming." I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs stopped working. The tile was cold through my pajama pants, and I pressed my back against the cabinet, and I looked at this boy standing in the grey pre-dawn light, and I said, "Tell me everything." He sat down across from me, and he did. Ely told me his mother hadn't died in a car accident. She had died at home. In this house, actually. They'd lived here before I came. She had died of what the initial report called an accidental overdose of her anxiety medication combined with alcohol. My husband had been the one to find her. My husband had been the one to call 911. My husband had been the one to stand in the driveway while the paramedics worked and say over and over, "I don't understand. She seemed fine, I don't understand." Ely had been 10 years old. He had been in his room. He had heard everything. "She didn't drink," Ely said. He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact you've had 3 years to make peace with. "She had 1 glass of wine at Christmas and that was it. She hated the way alcohol made her feel. I never once saw her drink at home." I opened my mouth. He kept going. "After she died, I started having these, I don't know what to call them, blackout episodes. That's what the doctors said. Stress response, trauma-induced. I'd lose feeling in my legs for hours at a time. Then one day I lost it and it didn't come back, and all the doctors, they said it was psychosomatic paralysis from the grief." He paused, and I let them think that. Because the day I lost feeling in my legs was the day I realized that as long as I was in a wheelchair, my father would not see me as a threat. The cold coming through the back door had turned the kitchen almost frigid, but neither of us moved to close it. "I heard him on the phone, maybe 4 months after Mom died," Ely continued. "He didn't know I was in the hallway. He was talking to someone, a woman, I think. And he was saying that the life insurance had been held up because of the investigation, but that it would come through. He said," Ely stopped, swallowed. He said, "Once the kid is handled, we can actually live." Once the kid is handled. I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the open door. "I was 10, Ely said. "I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I knew enough. I knew enough to understand that staying in that chair was the safest place I could be. A kid in a wheelchair is invisible. A kid in a wheelchair doesn't get handled." He had spent 3 years watching, cataloguing, being a perfect, uncomplaining, easy-to-manage presence, while behind those dark eyes he was building a case file that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. He had memorized phone conversations through the heating vents. He had taken photos of documents he found in the Home Office using an old tablet he kept hidden under his mattress. He had written dates and times in a small spiral notebook tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of The Call of the Wild on his bookshelf. When my husband started dating me, Ely had watched that too. He'd watched my husband perform grief at dinner parties. He'd watched him cry on cue. He'd watched how carefully my husband calibrated his charm, turning it up when needed, withdrawing it as punishment. And Ely had watched me fall for it, and he had wrestled, he told me, with whether to say anything. "I didn't know if you were safe," he said. "I didn't know if telling you would make things worse. I thought," he looked at the floor, "I thought maybe you would believe him over me. I was a traumatized kid in a wheelchair. He was a respectable man. Who was anyone going to believe?" That hit me somewhere deep and quiet, because he was right. If he had told me 6 months ago, before any of this, before the gas, before the dead phone, I don't know what I would have done. I want to believe I would have listened. I don't know if that's true. Why now? I asked. Why tell me now? He looked at me steadily. Because last week I found a new insurance policy for you. He took it out 3 months ago. $2 million. He reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a photograph of the policy document, printed on the tablet. He doubled down. You were supposed to have a gas accident this morning while he had a provable alibi 3 states away. I looked at the paper. My name, his signature, an effective date from January. I had 90 minutes before my husband's check-in call at 7 a.m. The call he made every morning from trips, always exactly at 7, which I now understood was its own form of surveillance dressed up as affection. I had no working phone. Ely stood up, crossed to the kitchen junk drawer, and pulled out a phone I had never seen before. A cheap, prepaid flip phone, the kind teenagers bought at Walgreens. I've had this for 8 months, he said. For an emergency. He held it out to me. I took it. My hands were steady by the time I dialed 911. I don't know how. Maybe some part of me had already accepted what was happening long before I had the words for it. I told the dispatcher there had been a gas leak, that I believed it was deliberate, that I had documentation of a suspected insurance fraud plot and possible prior foul play in the death of a woman named Renata, my husband's first wife, 3 years ago. I gave our address. I told them my husband was out of state and I had reason to believe he would be monitoring whether I called for help, so I needed them to move quickly and quietly. The dispatcher's voice shifted. She asked me to stay on the line. I stayed on the line. 2 cruisers and a fire department unit arrived within 11 minutes. While they were ventilating the house and 1 officer walked through the kitchen documenting the gas valve, Eli went to his room and retrieved the hollowed-out copy of the Call of the Wild. He brought it to the officer taking my statement and set it on the table and said, 3 years of records, dates, times, conversations, photographs of documents. I can explain everything in that notebook. The officer looked at this 13-year-old kid in his grey socks and Columbus Crew hoodie and then looked at me, and I saw something move across his face that I think was shock, barely held in check. How old are you, son? He asked. 13, Eli said. 14 in June. My husband's call came in at 7 a.m. exactly. I didn't answer. By 7:15, a detective had already been in contact with the Denver PD, and by the time my husband landed his rental car outside the hotel and called a second time, there were officers waiting in the lobby. He was arrested in the elevator on his way up to the 6th floor, still in his wool coat, still carrying the leather overnight bag I had helped him pack 2 days before. I found all of this out later, piece by piece, through the detective assigned to the case and eventually through the court proceedings that followed. What I remember from that morning is mostly small and sensory, the smell of the ventilated kitchen slowly replacing the gas smell with cold Ohio air, the sound of Eli asking one of the firefighters if he could borrow a phone charger, the pale yellow light coming through the kitchen window as the sun finally came up over the neighbor's roof. At some point, one of the officers asked Eli if he needed anything, if there was a family member they could call. Eli looked at me. She's my family, he said. The investigation took 14 months. I won't compress it into something tidy because it wasn't. It was drawn out and exhausting, and there were days when I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store and cried until I had nothing left. And then I drove home and made dinner and helped Eli with his homework and told myself that we were going to be okay. The detectives exhumed the case files on Renata's death. The original medical examiner's report had flagged some inconsistencies but deferred to the overdose ruling due to the existing prescription, with new eyes and Eli's records pointing investigators to specific dates and financial transactions. The picture that emerged was damning, a pattern of increased prescription refills in the months before her death. $200,000 moved to a separate account 11 days before she died. A text thread recovered from a backup server between my husband and a woman in Cincinnati that laid out, in language that was almost bureaucratic in its coldness, a plan. He was charged with first-degree murder in Renata's death, 2 counts of attempted murder for what happened in March, and insurance fraud. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. He was convicted on all counts. I was in the courtroom for the verdict. Eli was with me. He had asked to be there. His therapist and I discussed it at length, and ultimately it was his call to make. He sat beside me in a button-down shirt with his hands in his lap, and when the foreperson read the verdict, he didn't cry or cheer. He just exhaled slowly, like he was releasing something he'd been holding in his chest for 3 years. I reached over and took his hand. He let me. People ask me sometimes. They asked me a lot in the months after, neighbours, co-workers, the woman at my church who meant well, why I hadn't seen the signs, why I hadn't figured it out myself. I tell them the truth, which is that I was looking at a man who had learned over many years exactly how much warmth to perform and exactly when to perform it. I was a woman who wanted to believe in second chances. I was also, if I'm being honest, someone who had been quietly trained by that relationship to distrust my own perceptions, to explain away the cold silences, the moved objects, the sense that I was always slightly off balance without knowing why. The person who saw clearly was a kid in a wheelchair who had decided that surviving meant staying invisible and watching and waiting, who had protected himself the only way available to him, who had protected me too, before I even knew I needed it. Eli lives with me now. That took some navigating, legally, emotionally, practically. His paternal grandmother contested the guardianship initially, but she withdrew once the full scope of what her son had done became public record. My mother, who drove up from Columbus the week after the arrest and spent 2 weeks sleeping on my couch and making soup I didn't ask for and didn't need but ate anyway, told me at some point that taking on a teenager in the middle of all this was too much, that I needed to think about myself. I told her that Eli wasn't something I was taking on, that it didn't feel that way at all. He started walking publicly about 6 weeks after the arrest, not dramatically. One morning he just came into the kitchen without the wheelchair and poured himself a bowl of cereal and sat at the counter, and I made myself say nothing, made myself not turn it into a moment, because I understood that he needed it to be ordinary. My legs actually work fine, he said, like he was reading from a grocery list. I figured, I said. He ate his cereal, I drank my coffee. Outside, the neighbour's dog was barking at a squirrel in the oak tree, and the March light was coming through the window, the same as it had that terrible morning, except now it was just light. Just morning, just the two of us starting another day. He got a full scholarship offer to a STEM boarding program in the fall. He's extraordinarily good at math, which surprised exactly no one who had watched him spend 3 years conducting a covert investigation at age 10 with a spiral notebook and a second-hand tablet. He's considering it. We've talked about it a lot. You don't have to go anywhere, I told him once. He thought about it for a second. I know, he said. But I think I might want to, for me, not because of him. That distinction, for me, not because of him, was the most grown-up thing I'd ever heard anyone say. 13 years old, sitting at my kitchen counter, and he already understood something that takes most people decades, that the way you choose to move forward should be yours, not just a reaction to what was done to you. I told him that. He looked slightly embarrassed and changed the subject to whether I thought the Crew had a chance in the playoffs, which felt like exactly the right response. We are not a before and after story. There was real damage, and it lives in us, both in ways that therapy helps but doesn't erase. There are nights I still wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart hammering and reach for my phone to make sure it's charged. There are moments when I catch myself studying a man's face in public, a stranger, just someone in line at the bank, and mapping his expressions for signs, cataloguing micro-pauses the way Eli once catalogued phone conversations through a vent. But there were also Tuesday evenings when Eli and I cook dinner together, and he burns the garlic every single time without fail and refuses to acknowledge that he's the one burning it, and I let him, and we eat it anyway. There are Saturday mornings when he stays in his room until noon, and I drink my coffee in peace and feel for long stretches, something that I think is just ordinary life. The good kind of ordinary. The kind that used to seem too small to want and now feels like the whole world. His mother loved him fiercely. I know that from everything he's told me. She saw exactly who he was. I never got to meet her, but there are moments, usually when he says something unexpectedly sharp and kind, when I feel the outline of her presence in him, the way she shaped him before she was taken. I think about her more than I expected to. I hope she knows her son is standing up. I keep coming back to one image. A 13-year-old boy sitting on a cold kitchen floor across from me in the dark, holding 3 years of carefully kept records inside a hollowed-out copy of a children's novel, waiting to see if I was someone he could trust. What Eli did wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct in the simple animal sense. It was something he built, deliberately, quietly, over years, while everyone around him saw only a grieving child in a wheelchair. He chose, at age 10, to be smarter than his circumstances. He chose to observe rather than react. He chose to protect himself the only way available to him, and then, when the moment came, he chose to protect me too. That kind of thinking doesn't happen by accident. It's the product of a mind that refuses to stop working even when everything around it is designed to make it feel powerless. I think about that every time I'm tempted to underestimate someone because of what they look like or what they've been through. And then there's the question of who he chose to become inside all of that. He had every reason to go cold, to close off, to decide that the world was simply people who hurt you and people who hadn't gotten around to it yet. Instead, he stayed curious. He stayed fair. When he decided to trust me with the truth, he didn't do it carelessly or out of desperation. He did it because he had watched me long enough to believe I was worth the risk. That kind of moral clarity in a child who had been through what he'd been through is not something you can fake. It comes from somewhere real. It comes from deciding over and over again in small moments no one else sees to keep your integrity even when the person who should have modeled it for you never did. My husband's choices caught up with him in the end. Not because of fate, not because of anything cosmic, because of cause and effect, plain and simple. He spent years constructing a version of himself that other people would believe, and he never once considered that the person watching him most carefully was the one he had already dismissed. That's how it goes, I think. The damage we do doesn't disappear just because we've convinced ourselves we're untouchable. It accumulates, it waits. And eventually someone with a spiral notebook and a prepaid flip phone hands it to a detective. I'm not who I was before any of this. I don't think I want to be. The woman who walked into that marriage was someone who confused performance with substance, who let tenderness override perception, who believed that wanting something to be true was close enough to it actually being true. I'm more careful now, more willing to sit with discomfort instead of explaining it away. That's not cynicism, that's just what it looks like when you finally decide to trust your own eyes. Ely starts his STEM program in the fall. He texted me last week to ask whether I thought he should bring his paperback collection or leave it at home. I told him to bring it. He said maybe just the good ones. I said that seemed right. We're going to be okay. We already are.